I wanted to share with you a quick thought and address a question that is likely bothering many people, which is, our Mishnah teaches us that the unwalled cities read the Megillah on the 14th of Adar, and walled cities read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar. And how do we define a walled city? If it was walled from the days of Yoshua ben Nun. We learned on Daf Beis Amar Beis 2b that there are those who argue and say that it goes by from the days of Achashverosh, was walled during that time. But the Mishnah and the way that we rule, the way we paskin is, it goes by if it was walled from the days of Yoshua ben Nun. So let's try to tackle two questions. Number one, why are there different days for unwalled cities and walled cities? I understand that Shushan maybe should have a different day, because Shushan, they fought the battle an extra day and they rested a day later. So they'll read the Megillah a day later on the 15th. But everywhere else, what's the difference? Why is a walled city different than an unwalled city? That's number one. And number two, why should we define a walled city by if it was walled from the days of Yoshua ben Nun? As we might say in Yeshiva, what shaychus? What does it have to do with anything? Why should it be that we define a walled city by whether it was walled from the days of Yoshua ben Nun? And even though the Gemara learned it out that we have a Gzeira Shava, prazi, and we have a pasuk, but even still, that just means the Anshe Knesset Gedola, the men of the Great Assembly, when they wrote the Megillah, Mordechai and Esther, whoever wrote the Megillah, they put it in, they put a connection in to bring out this idea. But why? Why was that the way that this was enacted? So the Ramban, at the very beginning of his commentary on Maseches Megillah, addresses both of these questions. And the Ramban says that if you think about it, so Haman made a decree to annihilate all the Jewish people on the 13th of Adar. Who was in the most danger? The people in the most danger were those who lived in unprotected cities, in unfortified cities, in unwalled cities. They were in the most danger. Everyone was in danger, but those who were in the most danger were those who were unprotected. Didn't have a wall around their city or their village. So therefore, comes the 13th of Adar, and a great miracle happens. We defeat our enemies, and we rest on the 14th, and therefore we celebrate Purim on the 14th. But the way it went down, and he reads this into all of the psukim in the Megillah, so everybody celebrated the first year. It says, the pasuk says in chapter 9, verse Tezayin 16, the pasuk says, Ushara Yudim Asher B'nos HaMelech, the rest of the Jews in all the provinces, meaning besides for Shushan, but everywhere, Nikalu v'amod al nafsham, they gathered and stood up to protect themselves on B'yom Shloshah Asar, on the 13th of Adar, v'noach b'arba asar bo, and they rested on the 14th, v'asor so yom mishteh v'simcha, they made that day a day of mishteh v'simcha, of feasting and joy. And that was true whether you were in a walled city or an unwalled city, everywhere except for Shushan. Now in Shushan, they also celebrated the miracle a day later, because they continued to fight on the 14th, and they celebrated on the 15th, and that year they made the 15th a day of celebration. That was all the year of the Purim miracle. Now after that, the next year, Purim wasn't enacted immediately by the Chachamim. The next year, so all those who were in unwalled cities recognized the tremendous miracle and salvation that they experienced, and they celebrated again on the 14th of Adar the next year. And they did that on their own, and they made it a day of mishteh v'simcha. They made it a day of joy and feasting. But the walled cities who felt somewhat protected, less threatened, didn't feel as much that a miracle had happened to them, and therefore they didn't continue to celebrate in subsequent years. They did not, on their own, make a yontif out of this day because of their great salvation, because to them it wasn't as big a miracle. And therefore the pasuk says there, in the same chapter, chapter 9, verse 19, pasuk Yotes, it says, The Jews who were scattered, who lived in the unwalled cities, Osim es Yom Arba'asar Chodesh Adar. They made the 14th a Simcha Mishteh. Just the unwalled cities. Not the walled cities, no celebration. However, after a time, so the Ramban says, Hashem opened the eyes of the Chachamim, and they found a hint in the Torah to make this into a Yantif. And that's going to be a Gemara later on Daf Zayin on 7a. So then Mordechai and his court, they got up and they established Purim as an actual holiday, and they made it a holiday for everybody, not just the unwalled cities, everybody. There's a great celebration of the salvation of the Jewish people. However, when they did that, they wanted to distinguish between the unwalled cities and the walled cities, because it was a bit of a different level of miracle for the unwalled and the walled. And therefore, they said, since the miracle was greater for those in the unwalled cities, so they should celebrate first. Number one, because it was greater for them, and also because they on their own had started the celebration. They were already celebrating it. They got the 14th as their day of celebration. But to distinguish and say, for the walled cities, it wasn't as great a miracle, so they were to celebrate on the 15th. That's what the Ramban suggests for why there's a difference. Really, I didn't mention in leading up to this question, he says, why would we differentiate? We try to make one Torah. We try to have everybody doing the same thing. Why would they build in a distinction? Where do we find such a thing in the Torah that people have different days? Now, we have second day Yantif, but we don't have a different day. We all have the first day of Yantif, right? So where do we have such a concept? And the Chacham usually model things after the Torah. So the Ramban explains this is the reason. They wanted to distinguish between the unwalled cities and the walled cities, because the unwalled cities, number one, had celebrated on their own on the 14th, and number two, the miracle was greater for them, and therefore they had their own day, the 14th, and then the people who were in the walled cities had the 15th. Okay, and then he reads into the psukim of how it was enacted. We'll leave that for now, but let's just get to our second question. Okay, so the walled cities celebrate on a different day. But why are we determining what's a walled city from whether it was walled in the days of Yoshua ben Nun? We should determine it based on whether it was walled at the time of Achashverosh. So the Ramban suggests as follows, and he says that at that time, there were already many Jews living in Eretz Yisrael again. We know that they had restarted the building of the Beis HaMikdash, and Achashverosh had put a stop to it. Many Jews had already gone up to Eretz Yisrael. It was under Persian rule, and they were still under the threat of Haman's decree. They were not safer, but there were many Jews in Eretz Yisrael. But Eretz Yisrael was in a state of destruction. All the cities that had used to be built up and fortified and walled had been destroyed. Yerushalayim and any other city. They were no longer walled at this time. Therefore, says the Ramban, if we went by whether it was walled at the time of Achashverosh, so it would be like a reminder and a statement that at that time, Eretz Yisrael was destroyed. Yerushalayim was destroyed. Yerushalayim wouldn't be a walled city because it wasn't walled at the time. The wall had been destroyed. And so, out of kavod, out of the honor of Eretz Yisrael, we said we're not going by whether it was walled at that very moment. We want this distinction of unwalled and walled cities, but we're going to determine walled based on, was it walled from the days of Yoshua ben Nun? We're going to go back to that time out of a kavod, out of the honor, because otherwise it would be a diminishment, it would be some kind of insulting to Eretz Yisrael and the cities of Eretz Yisrael, since there were no walled cities at that time, everything had been destroyed. So none of them would celebrate Purim on the 15th, on the day of the walled cities. That would be a significant reminder of the destruction. They didn't want that. They wanted to give honor to Eretz Yisrael. And he says this is really implied in the Yerushalmi. The Yerushalmi says, Reb Simon b'Shem Ri ben Levi says, Cholku kavod l'Eretz Yisrael, ki haisa chareva bosing hayamim, v'tolu oso b'mei Yoshua ben Nun. I'm not sure how much of that is a quote. At least the part where Cholku kavod l'Eretz Yisrael, they gave kavod to Eretz Yisrael because it was destroyed in that time, and they make it determined by whether it was walled in the days of Eretz Yisrael. And he says, that's exactly what I'm saying. It's all about the kavod of Eretz Yisrael. Really, they weren't walled at that time, but to give honor to Eretz Yisrael and not kind of blatantly express that it was in a state of destruction at the time, and therefore, sorry, you're all, even though you're Yerushalayim, you're HaKodesh, which is this great walled city, but since at the time you weren't walled, you read like everybody else. No, we wanna treat Eretz Yisrael with special honor, and therefore we don't want to implicitly say that it was in destruction at that time, and therefore, as long as it was walled from the days of Yoshua ben Nun, we will consider it a walled city. And that's this opinion, and there's the other opinion that says, no, we're going to go by whatever was walled at the time, which also makes sense, because we're saying it really has to do with what happened at that time. He doesn't go with this special honor for Eretz Yisrael idea, but we do. That's the Mishnah Paskins, and that is indeed the halacha.